Before the Egyptian conflict, the Tunisian government emboldened people across the Middle East and North Africa to rise against their leaders. It inspired several ongoing protests in Algeria, Jordan, and Yemen. Many cited the unmerited beating of an innocent, Khaled Said, in 2010 by the police. The people of these Arab nations had enough of the unjust dictatorship that has overpowered them for the past decades. Under Mubarak's regime, Egypt had a massive income gap. One half of Egyptians lived on $2 a day or even less. The average income per capita in the country was just over $6,000. The minimum wage hadn't risen in the past 25 years. The political environment weakened the cost of labor to appeal to the advantages of major companies, both domestic and foreign. Under economic stress, social factors also came into play. Islamic, liberal, anti-capitalistic, nationalist, and feminist parties fought for their beliefs. Eventually, this would lead to the 18-day Egyptian Revolution of 2011.
By January 25, 2011, the conflict had reached stage 2. Egyptians began a nationwide revolt against poverty, corruption, and 30 years of rule by President Mubarak, marking the debut of massive protests on the streets of Cairo and other cities. Word spread over the internet about the upcoming revolution, and protests gathered in Tahrir Square to dispute the current regime. BBC reported at least 3 deaths during the protests in Cairo in Tahrir Square.
Sectarian violence between the Islamic government and the citizens took place after years of violations of human rights. After decades of dictatorship and corruption, Egyptians needed to rise against their unjust government and terminate Mubarak's rule. Protesters demanded the termination of Mubarak's cabinet as well as the suspension of the parliament elected in late 2010, a poll widely suspected of being rigged. In retaliation, police started using tear gas early on Wednesday in an attempt to disperse the crowds, and many people were beaten. They also banned any further public revolts. Violence between opposition groups and the government became frighteningly more frequent. Over 840 people were killed in the quest to oust President Mubarak.
Meanwhile, third parties have begun to mediate in stage 4 of the conflict. The EU called for free and fair elections in Egypt. Mubarak announced on television that he would not run for re-elections but refused to step down from office, which was the main demand of the protesters. Mubarak promised to reform his regime and said that his government would focus on improving the economy and providing employment. Unfortunately, clashes between anti-government and pro-Mubarak protesters continued to break out. An Egyptian protester, Mohamed El-Baghadi, said Mubarak's pledge to abandon office was an act of deception. The UN chief, Ban Ki-moon, added his thoughts, saying that 2 opposing parties needed to speak and end the conflict.
The transition into the 5th stage of the conflict was not at all peaceful. On February 10, 2011, Mubarak gave a televised speech in which he repeated his promise to not run in the next presidential election. Protesters in Tahrir Square reacted with rage once again when Mubarak said that he's remaining in power until September. The revolutionaries demanded the army join them in revolt and threw their shoes in protest. Finally, President Mubarak resigned after tens of thousands of people took to the streets across Egypt in angry protests. Tahrir Square began to clear out at last, and traffic began to flow once more for the first time since the revolts commenced.
The Egyptian conflict never reached a stable 6th stage. The aftermath of the 2011 Egyptian Revolution continued to be violent on several occasions. However, the people of Egypt did work together to rebuild the economy and restore destroyed infrastructure after the first wave of the revolution. Moreover, the population democratically elected on June 24, 2012, the new president of Egypt, Mohamed Morsi.
Alas, the conflict reached a 2nd stage 1. After being democratically elected on the 24th of June 2012, Mohamed Morsi changed numerous laws which upset the population. On the 30th of June 2013, mass protests broke out all over Egypt, demanding Morsi to step down. They were upset about the huge fuel shortages that the country has been facing. Also, there had been several electricity outages. Morsi also changed laws limiting people's rights. Although he was elected democratically, he committed many actions which would be considered undemocratic. The opposition blamed Morsi for not increasing the standard of living. This was what he promised to do when he was chosen president. Also, Morsi, who belonged to the Muslim Brother Party, had made reforms that reformed the country to be more Islamic. An example of one of these laws is that he forbids the stewardesses of Egyptian Air to wear red lipstick.
The army sided with the protesters and demanded that if the needs of the population were not met by the 3rd of July, they would remove the democratically elected government, including Morsi. The Muslim Brothers said that the army wanted to overthrow the government, to take all power for themselves. But the army insisted that they did not want to rule the country. Protests between the Muslim Brothers following the Morsi regime and the opposition end in numerous fights, the army and the police taking the side of the opposition.
At this point, Egypt is at the stage of conflict. The Muslim Brothers and the protesters are openly at war with each other. Since the government has been overthrown and the army had taken control, the Muslim Brothers are in a great minority. Hundreds of mosques have been burnt down and hundreds of casualties have fallen. It looks like this conflict will be going on for a while. On the 18th of August this year, 36 Muslim brothers suffocated because of the tear gas that security forces fired into the prison lorry holding them.
In conclusion, the interstate conflict in Egypt is not a civil war, as several countries around the world have been affected, including US and surrounding Arab nations. However, Egypt has not encouraged other countries to intervene.